17 minutes before 11 p.m. Central African time. Let's get into our very first conversation that looks to address our relationship with failure. Now, failure is universal, but what we really fear is what it means to fail. And so these are some of the tags that people have associated with failure. Things such as shame, disappointment, loss of self-worth. Those are some of the tags that come with the term failure. Now, psychologists call it the fear of failure, a mindset that fuels procrastination, burnout, and risk avoidance. In Africa, where success often carries a community expectation, this fear can silence innovation and ambition. Now, trauma counselor and wellness consultant Nokuthula Kakaza helps people transform failure into growth through mindfulness, resilience, and self-compassion. She joins us to unpack the psychology of fear, the stories that sustain it, and how we can redefine failure. And that can help us heal, it can help us grow, and it can help us rise stronger. Thank you so much for joining us, Nokuthula. We appreciate your presence on the show. Welcome to African Diaries.
Thank you for having me.
Nokuthula, I want us to start off just by looking at your trauma-informed perspectives, right? What does failure represent to most people? I mean, we talked about a few tags. We spoke about how people associate shame, disappointment, loss of self-worth. But what are some of the nuances that we perhaps don't understand of face value when it comes to failure?
Well, first off, I think one of the biggest things that we often overlook around failure is that it actually lost in our memories. That experience of not making it, of the outcome not being what we'd expected, it tends to last for us in our minds through our memory and be on a continuous replay and further exacerbates into our nervous system where our bodies remember what it felt like when I failed, how I was responded to as a child when I'd failed, how I've responded on my own or my partner responded to me when I failed. So those kind of things have a lot to do then with our ability to bounce back into resilience after failure or to find ourselves stuck in a negative loop.
Nokuthula, what's really interesting is that you said that the memory remains. How does this memory begin to pierce who we are as we progress forward? Because it's one thing to have the memory, but I want to know how it presents itself after the fact through the lens of trauma.
All right. So let me start off then by introducing trauma in itself. So trauma by definition is a wound. So if you think about wounds, if they remain open and unaddressed, they ultimately become septic. And when they become septic, they become a lot more infectious than what they were in the beginning. And that can ultimately lead to amputation because there's too much infection. It is beyond repair. Now, if we're talking about an experience of failure that was hostile or negative or left a trauma imprint in the mind and in the body, then what that means is when I see failure or I see the prospects of failure, which we all go through, by the way, but when I see it from someone who's had a traumatic experience prior around failure, I'm going to be stuck in that. My mind is going to shut down. I'm going to be under the illusion that I cannot move forward. I have no capacity to move forward. I'm hopeless. It's hopeless. What's the point of trying? A lot of self-loathing, a lot of self-shaming, a lot of self-blaming. But again, remember, this would have a lot more to do, not only with the disappointment of what didn't happen, but about how that disappointment was handled within my environment. Our first exposures to failure starts in our developmental phases in early childhood.
Nokuthula, you said quite a bit there, and I love the fact that you likened it to a wound, and the progression of this undealt with wound in the physical and tangible. You said that these of course, have an imprint from earlier on, right? So what are the manifestations that you would see in an adult because this happened when they were young? And I'm saying this because I've noticed that more often than not, we struggle to identify trauma. right?
Yes.
It isn't as clear as day. Yet we remember the feeling that we felt when we experienced this failure. And as opposed to receiving attention, affection, dealing with the wound at hand, we sort of didn't get what we think we needed. And that's also another thing I want to address. The memory that we have, is it because of how people responded to as compared to what we wanted? Or is it because people did not deal with our failure correctly?
Oof, I love that. Did they not deal with our failure correctly, or did we struggle to deal with our own failure? Here's the thing: as a young mind developing in a social world, you learn right from wrong through your society. So that kind of answers that first half, right? Because the people around us determine what's safe and what's not safe. The people around us tell us if we have the capacity to keep moving or not. And then as we evolve into maturity, when we start to learn a sense of autonomy and we start to decide for ourselves what's progress, what's not progress, what's success, what's not success. But in early childhood, a lot of it comes from how the people around us in our society, in our homes, first and foremost, deal with our inability to perform as per intended expectation. Now, you touched on something significant also around what is it about this failure thing that makes it so long lasting in our thought processes, and it has a lot to do with our sense or a desire for control. I set out a task for myself to, let's say, reach 1,000 followers. We'll use social media as a context. To reach 1,000 followers within 7 days. In 7 days, I come and I reach only about 300 followers. Now, that can be disappointing and things don't always go our way. But if I come from an environment when I don't meet the intended target, I am shamed, I am beaten, I'm belittled, I'm not going to take not reaching my intended target very well. Again, the mental imprint of how failure in earlier life was dealt with has a lot to do with how we start to perceive our own failures too.
The voice there of Nokuthula joining us this evening, Nokuthula Kakaza, who's here to help us better gauge this fear that we have of failure and redefine our relationship with failure. She is a trauma counselor and wellness consultant. It is 50 minutes after 10 p.m. Central African time. A quick breather if this is a bit too much pressure. Then we get back.
Africa Speaks on African Diaries with Shayla Ndikumana.
We are discussing redefining our relationship with failure, and we're doing this with none other than trauma counselor and wellness consultant Nokuthula Kakaza joining us this evening. Nokuthula, we were able to set the foundational phase for understanding this particular subject matter, but I want to move into a more nuanced context. Right. And I suppose this is us widening the understanding of what failure does to a community. Now, in African contexts, community defines success as part of identity. And I'm not saying that this doesn't happen in other spheres, but notice how the praise is held high when you come back home and you are the engineer you said you were going to be, versus you failing a year and not being able to complete in record time and then feeling the pressure and then dropping out. It is a very contrasting view for most families and how they receive and experience you based on whether you succeeded or failed. Now, given that context permeating throughout the continent, what kind of communities do we become?
Oof, I love this. And I'm just making a note here that when we speak about an appraisal aspect, it has a lot more to do, especially in the description in which you shared it, that appraisal aspect has a lot more to do with self-esteem. And so the more we're appraised, the higher my sense of, I got this, I know what I'm doing. Because as human beings, by nature, we thrive on having support. We thrive on receiving that sense of appraisal, that sense of belonging, that sense of being celebrated in our communities. And it shapes us truly in terms of how we see ourselves too. And again, remember, before the community is external, it's internal. Now, if our identity or our sense of self-worth has a lot more to do with whether people care for us or not. We're going to have a problem as we're maturing. And I think, we talk a lot about this around social sciences and psychology when it comes to child development, around being careful about when we acknowledge our children. And you'll notice I keep reverting back to that because the struggle with the ability to navigate and manage failure has a lot to do, again, with how it was handled in our childhood. So in social science, we speak a lot around being cautious about when you acknowledge your children. Is it when they are performing well, or is it by virtue of their efforts? If effort is not well celebrated, then when I don't reach the intended outcome, I'm going to have problems around self-celebration. So again, appraisal, speaking more to self-esteem, means then I'm more identifying and I'm more in a successful mode, according to me, when I perform well. And when I fail to perform or reach the intended outcome, then I'm not good enough. I'm not worthy. And I actually do see it a lot in my practice spaces around how, young minds and even adult minds, when they're not acknowledged by the people they thought and were expecting would acknowledge them, it alters their ability to be able to embrace and accept their own wins.
Yikes. You speak often about self-discovery and purposeful healing. I want us to bring that, or rather self-rediscovery. I think that's such a key subject matter in what it is we're talking about now. So your childhood happened and you didn't have much control over it, but now you're an adult. Yes? You're a fully grown adult in this very interesting world. And you can't afford to sit back and say that this has happened to me, so this is what I've become. There's an opportune moment for you to turn the relationship that you have with failure into something prosperous for yourself. The question perhaps is, where do we start? I already have these habits I practice. I know what I go to cage myself in. I know what I do to maintain a certain look. And if I'm to be extremely honest, it's preserved me for this long. Where do I begin the conversation of change?
It starts with psychological education and language. Now, in my practice, one of the big things I do with all clients is let's first understand where your thought process is stemming from, and let's start using the correct language to describe what it is you're going through. This speaks to a narrative of identify what the challenge is, acknowledge its impact and its effect on you, process that, the emotions that come with that, the destruction and dysfunction that came with that, and thereafter release. Let it go, because it's no longer serving you in any way. And something we often overlook is that our coping strategies, whether positive or negative, are usually a direct correlation towards we're trying to upkeep ourselves. We're trying to defend and protect ourselves. Sometimes our protection mechanisms are not really healthy. Sometimes they are good for us, but also as we evolve and as we mature, we should be altering and improving those. So I love what you're saying. It happened in childhood. You can't do much about that. You handled it the best way you can. But here you are, an adult, and you need to work in a different manner now. So with psych education, what it says is understand what failure has meant to you historically versus what failure can mean to you now. When it speaks to the language use, I like to use words and turn them into acronyms for constructive frameworks and the ability to mentally reframe. So FAIL as an acronym, FAIL. The F could be standing for falling, right? I fell, didn't get the intended outcome. The A would speak for a negative attitude as a result of this. The I could speak to it was an illogical thing. I'm struggling to logically make sense of what transpired here. And the L is for losses. Now, this is a negative thought process and a negative narrative. Another example with that could be where the F stands for flawed. I'm flawed. My attempt was flawed. My business concept is flawed. A could stand for I'm afraid. Now that things are going to pan out the way I wanted to, I'm stuck in fear. I'm afraid. The I could be now inhibited. the inability to move forward, stuck in a freeze state. And the L could be limitation, limited thinking, therefore limited conduct. But if we're to reframe that, it can turn more into something positive where we can look at the F as a first attempt of learning. The A, again, we can look at it as a facing adversity and integrating and new lessons from that experience. We can look at it as forgiveness, acceptance, and integrating these new lessons. So how we perceive and see words has a lot to do with how we're able to kind of process then the adversities that we go through. But with reframing psychological work that I speak to around trauma, it's about understanding that one word that you've known as one way your whole life, if you open up your mind, can be reframed to have a completely different meaning altogether for you.
Nokuthula, what's really interesting is you said you need to conscientize rather the mind of the issue at hand, where it stems from, right? And then begin to work on the language. And then you said the let go part. And my brain went, people don't know how to let go when there isn't a replacement. I think of addictions, right? Remember back in the day when they used to say, eat an apple, eat an apple, eat an apple, right?
Yeah.
In the place of you maybe going to go smoke a cigarette. And a lot of people say that it works for the meantime. However, in the long stretch, it's not enough to replace an apple with a cigarette. Yeah. And so in the case and in the place of trauma, it's not just the pain that I'm fighting. It's also the habit that I need to undo. And so how do we begin to repurpose habits? You know, in the place of me shutting down, procrastinating, going, you know what, I'm not even going to try, because that was my go-to. That was my that's what kept me safe, is that I would be nonchalant, not try, and then nothing's going to happen to me. But if I want to change proactively, how am I intentionally repurposing habits without feeling extremely overwhelmed by the process?
Mind and body. In trauma work, we speak about suppressed emotional charge. If my attempt to fly, for the lack of a better description, if my attempt to fly led me to fall flat and break a leg, the next time I'm going to be trying to fly, my body's going to be telling me, we don't do that now. We're probably going to break a neck this time. We might not even survive.
Yep.
That's that fear speaking, based on feedback, based on lived experience. And what you're going against is what you've known versus what remains untapped. What separates these two things is the mindset. The one says, man, I tried it, didn't work, limits, cuts, that's it. The other says, okay, this didn't work, but why didn't it work? This is that process aspect. Identify, acknowledge, process. Why didn't this work? What did I overlook? What do I need to replace? Do I need maybe something a lot lighter? Am I using more heavy materials when I should be using lighter materials? What is it that's stopping me from being able to do what I need to do? But if we do not take a moment to reflect on what led us to this path, we will be stuck in repetitive dysfunctional habits, beating ourselves up against the wall because nothing is going to change, because you're still doing the same thing, expecting different outcomes, which is also described as insanity in itself, right? So part of that change starts with taking a moment to look at, how am I perceiving this particular experience? What am I understanding from this? Am I even learning from this? Or am I just stuck in the fear of what has happened and how that's affected me? You also touched on, how do we replace a negative habit? Habits are there as coping strategies. You're coping, meaning it's a symptom of something else that transpired. We cannot let go or move away from what we do not know. Hence the significance of identify, acknowledge. Are you struggling to move forward because it reminds you of the shame you had from childhood? Or are you struggling to move forward because you're questioning and doubting yourself? If you're struggling with self-doubt and an imposter syndrome, who else are you talking to about your ideas? Because sometimes conversing with yourself about yourself and your problems is just going to keep you stuck in a very negative thought loop, and you're not going to move forward. And this is why a community is important. People to bounce off our ideas, our interests, people to share on this journey towards some sense of a difference, a progress is so significant. Because when we forget who we are, the people around us in that community is able to tap you on the shoulder and be like, hey, I know this was a bit tough. It's not the outcome you wanted, but you know what? I've seen you do well. That reminder into the evidence of what has worked well helps contribute towards your ability to move yourself forward again.
The voice there of trauma counselor and wellness consultant Nokuthula Kakaza joining us this evening. Nokuthula, I want to touch on community, right? We live in such a individualized world,
Yep.
right? The hyper, if you will, awareness of your individuality is so much that I think that people struggle to connect. This is just my personal observation, right? And to the effect of our inability to let go of our phones when we are with each other is for me something that proves problematic altogether. And so in a world where we haven't created bonds that are sacred enough to be our safe space when we need a reminder, how do we remind ourselves? If I don't have a friend who's going to say, Shayla, you did really well, what am I putting in place as a barricade to me falling back into an old way of thinking? How am I constantly giving myself a thumbs up, even if I didn't reach the goal, but I practiced and got the effort in? What am I doing?
It starts with keeping track. I think one of our biggest hurdles around this relationship, or the poor relationship we have with progress or failure in itself, has a lot to do that we're not keeping track. It has a lot to do also with our default setting of, I can identify a lot of what's not going right, but I struggle with looking at what is going well.
Yeah.
And that mindset has a lot to do with the huge struggle we have around being able to acknowledge wins, because this one thing that hasn't gone right completely eradicates the 5 that have gone well. And if we're not keeping track of the effort we're putting in and how we're applying this effort, we're going to struggle with repeating strategy. As human beings, we are creatures of habit. We function best on patterns of repeated behavior. But if you're not paying attention to your patterns that lead to intended and desired outcomes, when failure happens, because it will happen, because nothing's perfect, we make mistakes. We're supposed to learn from those particular experiences. It's feedback and not just the limitation. And so when we're not able to kind of process that and reframe, those failures or fear moments as opportunities for feedback, opportunities for reflection, then we're going to be stuck in that negative thought process that I'm not doing enough, because there hasn't been an ability to keep track of what has worked well. Because when we're not doing well, we need those reminders that, okay, this happened in 2019, I bounced back. It happened around 2018, I bounced back. It happened in 2022, I bounced back. But how did I bounce back? Because also just having evidence that says, I made it is not going to be that good enough when you're already struggling with, okay, how do I get myself back into the momentum, the capacity, and the inner self-trust? So evidence is important. Keeping track of your developmental and progress milestones is very essential. Also, our behaviors, again, we focus so much, when you speak about how we live in an individualized world, it's where we're so focused on what can I do and what's my next, that we don't really take a moment just to stop and pause. We're not mindful, right? A full mind, which means present, both in mind and body, to be in this moment that, okay, I did it next. Oh, I did it next. And the more we keep chasing, we're never satisfied. And so when things don't go as we expected, we're bound to trip up and struggle to be able to take a moment to pause, because it's not a habit we've established in our daily behavior. And rest is such an integral part of our ability to perform well.
Nokuthula, we are pressed for time, so we'll leave it here. This has been fruitful. We hope to speak to you very soon. Thank you so much for your wisdom.
Thank you so much for having me.
That is the voice of trauma counselor and wellness consultant Nokuthula Kakaza joining us this evening. It is 8 minutes after 11 p.m. Central African time. We have geared you up for the conversation that is to come. We first addressed the redefining of the relationship that you have with failure, should that be of a negative state. And then we're going to get into adaptivity. So if you're thinking, Shayla, listen, I don't know if my career path is going to remain the same in the next 10 years. The industry that I'm in is ever evolving. I feel like I'm not catching up. And I just have this toggle between the now and the future that makes me feel as though I am being constricted. I can't move forward. I can't press forward. I don't know how to. Willem Goos is joining us in studio in a short bit, and we will be discussing adaptation, the ability to adapt to newer forms of your industry. And of course, this looked at through the lens of entrepreneurial thinking. That comes your way in a short bit.
Turn the page. It's African Diaries on Channel Africa.